Welcome to the Woman's Connection. I'm Barrie Switzen, your moderator. The Woman's Connection is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned?
Welcome. Beauty comes in all sizes and shapes. And actually, it's what we perceive as being beautiful. However, the beauty business is a $265 billion industry. And I would like to talk about beauty and what does it mean and how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive other people, and what we can do about it. And with me is Autumn Whitefield-Madrano. Autumn, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. You wrote a book called Face Value. What prompted you to start writing this book?
Well, I started writing about beauty 5 years ago. I started a blog initially, and I wanted to investigate beauty because I wanted to untangle my personal relationship with it. Because I had sort of told myself the story that when I was a younger woman in my teens and 20s, I didn't like how I looked and that I matured and grew out of it and now was at a place of peace. But when I really started interrogating my own relationship with beauty and looked through old diaries, I found that in fact my relationship with beauty had fluctuated throughout my entire life. And I thought, well, why did I sort of overwrite my actual experience and come up with this neat narrative arc? And so I wanted to investigate my own relationship and also talk with other women about their relationship to beauty. So I just started doing interviews with women from all different kinds of walks of life. And from there, the blog grew, and then from there came Face Value.
Well, didn't you work for various women's magazines? So how did that help shape your perspective?
I worked in women's magazines for more than a decade, and I still occasionally do work for them. And most of the time that I was on staff at a magazine, I was as a copy editor, which is a little bit more behind the scenes. I was never a beauty editor. I was never there meeting with beauty publicists or anything like that. So I sort of had this observational role, and just to see the careful crafting of messages that we would come up with about beauty and what constitutes beauty, I was just so intrigued by that, by the word choices that we would make around tools and effects that the women were hoping to create.
We've got many different races in this country and nationalities, but so we've got the slim face, we've got the round face, we've got the skewed face, whatever. How does the copy pertain to how the woman looks?
In women's magazines?
Yes.
It's so interesting because since I started in the industry, there's been such wonderful progress on recognizing that Americans are not homogenous. We are not all white. It's difficult though, because if you're trying to give shade recommendations to all of your readers, and your readers are everything from Irish American to Nigerian American. I mean, you have skin tones all over the spectrum. So beauty editors have to really, they have to be very knowledgeable in communicating what readers should be looking for in their own skin and how to know when something flatters them. It's a very intricate dance that I think editors do.
Because there's so many I mean, I hate it when somebody calls me honey. Honey, sweetie, to me, it is a very degrading commentary unless it's coming from my family, my intimate family, or somebody I'm involved with. But to me, I can't stand it. So you see all these other words, it's like, how can you insult somebody that you're trying to sell something to?
Well, you know, it's funny when you talk about words like sweetie, and that's not a beauty word exactly, but it illustrates what comes into play with beauty words. And that ostensibly, sweetie is a compliment. It's saying, I find you sweet, or I'm sweet on you. But I have the same reaction that you do. If someone calls me sweetie and we're not on intimate terms, ugh, I recoil. And you see that a lot with, like, cute is the perfect example, cute. Ostensibly, it's a compliment. On paper, it's a compliment. And I say things complimentary, oh, that's cute shoes, cute earrings, cute lipstick. But who likes to be called cute? Like, no grown woman really looks forward to being called cute, even if we might say it about ourselves, because it's a comfortable word. Like, a lot of women don't feel comfortable saying, well, yeah, I feel beautiful, I am beautiful. But they say, oh, I feel cute. So it's a strange, I mean, when we think about just the subtle differences in what different words mean, I mean, there's a whole world of communication happening.
How does one counteract that or address it?
With how we talk about ourselves or how we talk about other people?
Well, it could be a combination. I mean, I'm not going to call you cute unless your outfit is cute or I really like it. But how do you, in a magazine, how is that done? I mean, it's kind of, you know, it's like, who writes this stuff?
Yeah. You know, it's funny, a word that you see a lot in women's magazines is, for hair, locks or tresses. And no one talks like that. No one says, well, oh, what beautiful locks you have. If you say that in speech, it sounds so unnatural. And you never see that in regular writing either. Only in beauty copy do you see, you know, take care of your tresses with, you know, this conditioner. I think that women's magazines are getting better in that regard. And this is due largely to social media, in that you see this enormous influence that beauty bloggers and Instagram stars have, because they're not echoing women's magazine language. Some of them might, but the reason that beauty bloggers, the people are paying attention to them, is because they're normal people who don't use words like tresses and locks. They're saying hair, and if they have this, you know, editors, we're paid to make sure that readers don't get bored reading copy. And so one way an editor might do that is say, oh, well, the word hair appears 12 times in this page, let's change some of them. But then it just winds up sounding stilted and unnatural. So it's a fine line. With so many aspects of beauty, it's a fine line.
How has beauty changed during the centuries?
Oh, gosh, what a wonderful question. I mean, pick any point in history and you're going to learn a lot about the era that you're in. Within our more recent history, for example, you look at something like the 1950s. And yes, we have a stereotyped idea of what the 1950s looked like as far as women in beauty. But when you look at photographs, women really did have very coiffed hair compared to how it is now, a thicker sort of makeup. And that does echo to a degree the restrictions that a lot of women were under. You were expected to put time into your hair and to look like you put time into your hair. Whereas now we have this idea that women have all these other things that they should be spending their time on, but you're supposed to look just beautiful. So you haven't seen the expectation that women are beautiful lessen over the decades, but you've seen the amount of artifice or apparent artifice decrease. So it's been an interesting, if you look at photos of women in magazines today as opposed to 50 years ago, you see, oh, okay, you're just supposed to look a lot more natural now, but you still need to look just as beautiful.
Oh, God, then I'm in trouble because on a bad tress day, I wear a baseball cap. What makes a woman beautiful?
That's sort of the million-dollar question, right? I think, you know, you mentioned earlier the idea of beauty being basically in the eye of the beholder. And I resisted that idea for a long time throughout my research because I thought, oh, that's a little cheesy or a little pat. It sounded cliched to me. But the more I talked with people, the more I found that really is true. I mean, we've all had the experience of seeing someone who we think is really attractive, and we're like, to our friend, we're like, hey, look at that person. And a friend is like, ew, you know, or vice versa. We've all had that experience. So as far as what makes someone beautiful, I mean, I don't have a satisfactory answer there. I think a lot of it is, a lot of the times when we talk about beauty, we might be talking about conventional beauty, like something that we might see on a billboard or a magazine and be, oh, that person is what we as a culture consider beautiful. And we all recognize that. Even if we don't think that that particular person meets our personal subjective standard of beauty, we know who is considered beautiful and is not in our culture. But then the other answer is beauty is fascination. So whoever holds our attention, whoever fascinates us, that becomes beautiful to us more often than not.
Power have beauty?
It can. It's interesting that you say, can power have beauty? Because a lot of the times people invert that question. They say, is beauty powerful? But to ask if power has beauty, I think power can be intimidating. And what we are intimidated by, we're often have that push-pull relationship with. And I think that there can be beauty in there. I mean, if beauty comes down to fascination, then yes, we are fascinated by both power and by beauty. So yes, yes.
Do you find that women wear makeup just for themselves or for the public at large?
I would say it's a mix of the two. I was surprised when I interviewed women about their makeup habits to find that there were women who, even if they had no plans of leaving the house and seeing nobody, they would put on a full face of makeup. Because I never did that. For me, it was strictly a public act. And it's fun. I actually wear makeup now when I'm at home alone a lot more than I did before, because I thought, well, let me try this on for size. Let me see how it feels. And sure enough, I found it sort of put me in a little bit more of a mindset of I'm getting stuff done today. So, you know.
So it has a psychological effect.
Oh, it absolutely has a psychological effect. I mean, study after study has shown that it can make women feel more confident, more at ease. It makes other people see them as more confident as well. I would apply the caveat, though, that I think that that really only applies to women who feel comfortable in makeup. Like, I don't think that if you put a woman who doesn't like to wear makeup in makeup that she's going to feel more confident. Like, of course not. So I do find it fascinating that we feel more confident in makeup, but I always put that caveat out there because I don't want to make it sound like makeup is a must for women or is an instant confidence booster. Again, to go back to women's magazine language, it's not an instant confidence booster for every woman, but it can be. I mean, I have a friend, actually I mentioned this in the book, who suffers from occasional depression. And one clue to her that she's sort of tiptoeing toward that line where she needs to get help is that she stops wearing her lipstick. Because she wears this beautiful coral lipstick and it's very attention grabbing. And she knows for her that when she stops wearing it, that means she wants to hide from the world. So I find that interesting, that for her it's actually a symbol of mental health.
Wow, that's quite interesting. Now, Helen Curly Brown, she took over Cosmopolitan and changed the way women looked at themselves, thought about themselves, and about sex. Now, she ran the whole gamut.
Oh, yes.
What influence has she really had that's lasting?
First of all, I should say I find her a wonderfully complicated figure. I admire her. I admired her greatly. Her lasting influence, I think that her biggest influence really was on the world of women, sex, and enjoyment, in that she was one of the first women to publicly say women like having sex. They don't just do it to get a husband. They don't just do it to please a man. They do it because they have sex drive as well. And as far as how that played in with beauty, I think that she really cast beauty as something. It's funny. She was saying sex is something women do for themselves, but a lot of the beauty advice that she was sort of putting out there was about how to be sexy to lure in a man. So there was sort of I find her beauty attitudes a little more retrograde than her sex attitudes, actually.
Well, then again, she's writing a magazine. She's got to think of the sponsors.
Oh, yes.
She's got, so how much was sponsor-oriented versus, you know, true editorial, but at the same time, she revolutionized the business.
Oh, she absolutely did. I mean, there's never been anyone like her. She changed, I mean, women's magazines, obviously. She changed. I think she was crucial in making women's magazines a point of information for women's health, really, because when I think back to, I mean, you hear horror stories about young girls getting misinformation about sex all the time. But when I think back to when I was a young teen and reading teen magazine, 17 magazine, there was good sexual health advice in there. I knew about birth control, and I think that that would not have happened if it weren't for Helen Gurley Brown and her trickle-down effect on the whole industry.
Models. There's been a lot of discussion about toothpick models. Now, growing up, I was always, my mother was always asked if she ever fed me because I was always so thin. But what is going on with all these anorexic models? I mean, how is this beauty?
You know, it's actually gotten better in the past few years. You've seen a lot more size diversity on the covers of magazines, because I think that people were asking themselves exactly that, like, why is this our paragon of beauty? Why are we looking toward extreme thinness as something that we should aspire to? Because we all saw how it hurt girls and women. That said, even though the images are getting more diverse, there's not a blanket of convincing proof that that translates to how women feel about themselves. You can look at an image, at an idealized image, and feel like, oh, I'm never going to measure up to that, I'm never going to be good enough. Or you can look at an idealized image and be like, oh, well, she has hair kind of like mine, and yeah, you know, I bet if I had professional lighting, I would look as good as she does. And a lot of women do have that response, but we haven't paid much attention to that, which I find really interesting. So.
Well, that's good, because I know with all this digital photography now, you can manipulate the world.
Yes.
And it's like, what is real?
You can Photoshop yourself, basically. I mean, there's photo programs that let you do that on your phone with just a couple of clicks. So it's funny that we're trying to make ourselves more model-like just with the images. So.
Do men have the same problem with image and beauty as women?
I think that we're seeing a lot more pressure on men than we ever have to look a certain way. We still have an idea of what a conventional man looks like, but that he's still supposed to be kind of trim, muscular but trim. He's supposed to be clean-shaven but not too clean-shaven. You don't want him to look, you know, like a little boy. So men still have a pretty narrow line that they have to walk. And there's a lot more latitude for men than there is for women, but they deal with it too.
So growing up as a teenager, you're awkward whether you're a young man or a young woman. How do you navigate this quagmire to grow up and say, this is who I am and like who you are?
As far as awkwardness, that's a great point, because I think a lot of people might feel awkward and will translate to feeling not attractive. And I actually think awkwardness is a really appealing trait in people. When someone's a little bit awkward, I find that very endearing. So I would say if someone feels awkward in their skin, to just let that be a part of who they are, instead of trying to, you know, plaster over that part of themselves. Just be like, oh, I'm a little bit awkward, big deal.
Well, I think a lot has changed. I mean, since we've got YouTube, where everybody comes out with whatever they want to come out, the world has evolved. So people are more natural, accepting, and everybody's out there showcasing, I was going to say the pimple. I mean, it's just, they're showcasing everything. How do you see this going forward?
You know, that's a tough question. I'm 40 years old, and I see that happening more with younger people, with millennials, who have never had to make a division between public and private. You know, they grew up with social media being a part of their world. For me, I didn't grow up that way. So for me, when I'm posting anything on social media, it's very conscious. It's very much like, this is what I'm choosing to show the world. And I think some younger people, they might find that inauthentic. They would be like, oh, well, if it's a part of me, it should be a part of my social media package. Whether or not that's going to have a detrimental effect or a beneficial effect, I think it's too early to say. I will say that we have a way of fearing technology and saying, oh, this is the downfall of society, but people have historically been pretty creative in finding ways to make new technologies viable and interesting and ultimately beneficial to their generation.
Well, it's interesting because I had a very uncomfortable conversation with one of my cousins where she was posting her children in the bathtub. And I said, well, I won't say what I said because she got really upset. And, you know, it's like, excuse me, what's going on here? I mean, don't you, what's going on here? We got a bug. The point being, isn't there any privacy?
I mean, I definitely err on the side of being private. I very rarely post photos of myself. Even as an author, like I'll have certain images of myself out there, but because I hold my private life very dear and I don't want to make it public. But I think some people really do feel like, I don't know if you've heard the phrase, pics or it didn't happen. The idea being that pictures being put out there in the world actually validate the real experience. I'm not wired that way, but I'd be wary of saying that that is wrong, because if that's how a whole generation of people is experiencing the world, then there's something there that's a draw to them. There's something there that feels true about that, and I want to pay attention to that and interrogate that.
There's just not so much too much information. It's like too much information can get into the wrong hands and do you more harm than good. I mean, it's good to be frank, but who needs to know so much?
Right. That's what I ask myself before I tweet anything. I'm like, well, does this really need to be out there? And sometimes the answer is no, and I might do it anyway because it can be fun. It can be a fun, quick way of interacting with the world.
But how does that play into your face value?
I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think that there's actually studies showing that people who post a lot of pictures of themselves might have a more intact self-image because they're not afraid to showcase the fluidity of the self. And I find that interesting, whereas I'm someone who might have like one profile photo out there on Twitter or one on Facebook, but because I think, well, that's my public image. But someone else might take a totally different tack and say, well, I'm going to post, 2 selfies every day to show like a broader sense of who I really am. And I think that that's interesting, and I would say that that's valid as well. Certainly there's my author photo, that's the photo of me that is most prominent, but I've since cut 10 inches off my hair. My skin isn't normally that pale. It was taken in the dead of winter. So, is that a representative image of myself, or would people have a better idea of who I am if I had, 90 selfies out there right now? I'm not sure.
I think it all depends on if you're promoting yourself, promoting your business, or what the end game is. Yeah.
I think a lot of people just self-promote, but they're literally just promoting the self, which I don't understand that. But.
I think they're promoting themselves so that they can say, look at me, aren't I great? But sometimes it does have value. Not often, but it does have value.
Well, I think that in this, what we call the gig economy, and that a lot of more people are self-employed than have been in a very long time, and are working as contractors, you do it would behoove you to have a brand. As much as I shrink away from that term, I hate the idea of me having a brand in order to work. That said, that is how I get a lot of my own work. That is, that's part of how I make my living, is being known as the feminist who writes about beauty. So, I mean, I can't condemn it too much because I'm a part of it.
When you write about beauty, what's your favorite area you zoom in on?
I mean, broadly speaking, the sociology of beauty is like how I'm fascinated by how trends start, like especially with beauty trends, because for me, I just want to wear what makes me look my best. But then you see people on Instagram who are creating trends of having, I don't know, little rhinestones, or how does a darker eyebrow become a trend? You either have dark eyebrows or you don't, and yet dark eyebrows are a trend. I don't understand that paradox. So anything that kind of helps me untangle those kind of paradoxes, I'm drawn to.
Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. But if the woman can be beautiful but still feel insecure, and therefore she gives off a feeling of non-beauty, what do you have to say about that?
When I started interviewing women about beauty, I expected there to be some correlation between how a woman felt about her looks and her conventional beauty. And I found that to be not true in the least. I interviewed models, people who were professional beauties, this one woman said that she had to sometimes put newspaper over her mirror because she couldn't bear to look at herself. And then I interviewed women who were a little funky looking, you know, not unattractive, but a little off, who would be like, yeah, I feel beautiful, I am beautiful, whatever. And I think that really, I mean, a lot of when we talk about beauty, we're talking about something other than beauty. We're talking about sex appeal, we're talking about charisma, and we're talking about confidence. And so I think that it's impossible to deduce from just how a person might look in a photo, how you're actually going to experience that person as a beauty or a non-beauty or as a, you know, fake beauty or something, until you really get a sense of their person. And, you know, you see that in, you know, if you meet someone and they seem just kind of okay looking to you, and the more you talk with them, the more beautiful they become, it's because you're seeing something beyond just how their features are arranged on their face.
It's really very interesting. There's a lot of narcissism that goes around both men and women. But what is behind the veil of a narcissist?
You know, it's funny because paying an undue amount of attention to your self-presentation is a sign of narcissism. But I will say that we tend to hurl that accusation at women a lot more than men, even though just looking at as a personality disorder, more men have narcissism than women. So it's funny, we tend to sort of put an undue importance on vanity as a part of narcissism when they're not the same thing exactly. So I guess my first thing would be to go back and look at the gender aspect of narcissism and beauty and how that intersects. And I think that a lot of the times what we're talking about is a woman kind of putting a little too much attention on something and us wanting to shame her out of that. Which is not to say that there aren't vain women out there. Of course there are, absolutely. And to say when that crosses a line, I would say when she's unable to communicate with others effectively because she's so obsessed with her own appearance. That's sort of when you've crossed the line into something unacceptable. But I do think it's a gendered question at its root.
Autumn, this has really been very enlightening. In the closing moments of the show, what would you like to leave the audience with?
I would like to leave the audience with permission to interrogate their own relationship to beauty. Not what they want it to be, not what they think it should be, but to check in with themselves and ask, how do I really feel when I look in the mirror? And what can I take from that and apply to other areas of my life?
Wow. That's quite potent. All right. Thank you for joining us. What areas are you applying your beauty to in your life? Love to hear from you. Please write us here at The Woman's Connection.